Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to another CLHO Colleague Circle. My name is Amherst Williams, and I'm the Executive Director of the Connecticut League of History Organizations. I want to welcome you here today to a very timely conversation about sharing overlooked histories, where we'll be talking about some great work that's been going on around the state of Connecticut to interpret the African-American experience here. Just before we get started, a couple of notes. Please, if you haven't already, take time to introduce yourself to the group in the chat. You can find the chat by moving your mouse around. If you can't see the Zoom controls, they should pop up on the bottom of your screen. You can select chat. You can also see the participants list if you want to see who's here. And just a reminder that unless you're speaking, we would like you to mute your audio and your video. This just makes it easier for everyone to pay attention to the panelists while they're speaking. As we get to our group will speak, and then we'll have a broader conversation and Q&A afterwards. If you have a question that you want to ask, you can just shoot it in the chat as we go. I'll be monitoring the chat for questions, and we'll queue them up for our panelists once they're finished with their presentation. If you have a more involved comment you'd like to share, you'd like to speak, we can, open up things at the end. You can, put your video on and unmute yourself and talk, and we can moderate that later on. But for the time being, I'm going to hand things over to Beth Rose, CLHO Board President and also the Executive Director of the Jewish Historical Society of Greater Hartford, who put this session together and is going to introduce our panelists. Beth?
Thanks, Amherst. My name is Beth Rose. I'm the president of the Connecticut League, and great to see so many people joining us today. And I just wanted to say that we in CLHO been having conversations about how we can best respond and help our fellow organizations to respond to the call for racial justice and movements that have really demanded our national attention over the past few months. And we thought a great place to start would be by highlighting some of the really good work that is going on around the state, and that might inspire some of you to think of ways that your organization could undertake maybe something similar or something a little different, but just so that you have those examples. So there are many other also great organizations and projects going on around the state that we just chose a few for today to start with. And I wanted to let you know that we are also planning to bring back the workshop that we had originally scheduled for March on interpreting slavery in Connecticut. We've just been taking a little pause to figure out how we can best switch that into a virtual kind of format. So we're going to hear today from three different people representing different organizations. And we're going to start with Ramin Ganeshram from the Westport Museum for History and Culture. And she's the force behind their great exhibit called Remembered, which spans in time from the colonial era to the 20th century. And then we're going to hear from from Gigi Liverant at the Colchester Historical Society about their project on the School for Colored Children in Colchester, which is basically a 19th century story. And then we're going to hear from Tammy Kay at the Jewish Federation of Eastern Connecticut about the project that they undertook with the Lyman Allyn Museum, which is basically a 20th century project. So like a historian, I have plotted you into chronological framework. That's just me. So we're going to ask each person to speak for a little bit about their particular project. And then we'll hear from those three people, and then we'll open it up for questions that you might have about their specific projects or about other things. We at CLHO would especially like to get your feedback about what kind of resources we can provide to you to help you engage with this work if this is new to you, and what you might be thinking about. So I'll turn it over to Ramin.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you for having me, and welcome everybody. I'm so glad to see so many of you here. A little bit about our project. Our project was, as Beth said, called Remembered, the History of African Americans in Westport. And it did span from, the late 17th century up to the 20th century. The premise of the exhibit ran from May 2018 through the end of June 2019, and it was originally conceived. I should say that I had conceived of this exhibit as a guest curator. I'm a member of the town's Diversity Action Committee, which is called Team Westport. I was an executive director of the museum, which was then Westport Historical Society at the time. And over the course of the time of this planning, actually, this job became available and I applied for it and received it. So that shifted the exhibit a little bit, because being, instead of a guest curator, the person on the inside who could write the grants and sort of leverage the full force of the organization, it made the exhibit bigger than it was originally intended. So I say that to say that it was originally intended on a very, none of these questions are simple, but for the lack of a better word, I'll say very simple and straightforward premise, which was that in towns like Westport, and many towns in Connecticut, but certainly here, where there's consistently a discussion about things like fair housing and equitable access, what I often heard said, and I've lived in Westport for 11 years, I'm from New York City, what I've often heard said as almost, I'll call it an excuse, if you will, or a statement around this lack of equity and diversity, is that, well, Westport and Darien and Greenwich and all these towns were never diverse in the first place. That's the statement. There never were people of color here. And in thinking about this over many years, of course, that makes no sense, because Connecticut certainly was one of the original colonies. British colonies, of course, there were people of color. First, there were Native people for whom this land belonged. And then, of course, African Americans who were brought as enslaved people to work the land. It never made sense to me. So that was the premise, to sort of say, no, that idea that this was never diverse and therefore the lack of diversity now is just simply a happenstance of previous fact is in fact inaccurate. Once I got here, I started to dig through the archives and was able to access enormous documentary evidence of slavery in Westport. Deeds, probate documents, emancipation documents. Many of those records also were at the Fairfield Museum. Beth was a great help in that, being a librarian there at the time, because Westport was part of Fairfield. So the exhibit expanded. And what we realized we needed to do was to really address this history in a straightforward way, as well as all the other themes of African American life in this town. We really didn't want it to be simply a single-minded exhibit. We wanted to demonstrate that the lives of individuals are richly hued and span a whole variety of experiences. Because it is too easy, in our opinion, to categorize people as in one area and then kind of feel that you've done everything you can do to examine that life and be done with it. So what we did was we themed our exhibit in theme areas rather than a chronology, in large part because the themes that arose in the colonial period all the way up to 1990, when the exhibit roughly ended, chronologically, keeps crossing eras, right? So the themes were, it was organized, for example, so the themes were Bound, which was about the period of enslavement, Soldiers and Sailors, which talked about African Americans in military service from the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, all the way up through Vietnam. Activists, educators, and artists about the involvement actually of people both from the African American community and outside of it in activism. There was a section called Townsfolk that talked about, this is where we talked about free people and how they sort of incorporated into life in this area. And there were other themes as well. So this allowed us to talk about these really kind of big subjects across eras rather than trying to stick to a chronology and being forced to just choose one, point in the chronology. a couple of other things we did, because this evidence is largely evidence on paper, and we really wanted to make it interactive in as much as having people really feel the sense of the information. We did a few things. One was we did borrow objects where we could. We borrowed shackles from a collector here in Connecticut who has a very large collection of slavery-related artifacts. And some other items to sort of demonstrate as much as one can the horror of the condition of slavery. But we also built structures in our galleries, and I was looking for some photos. I couldn't find one, but I will share a ground plan that'll show some of this. One of the things we did was we built a scale model of a room in a house that still stands in Westport, where we know that 2 enslaved girls lived and died before they reached the age of 16. Previous historians and architectural historians posited and surmised that the young women, the young girls, lived in this room, which is effectively now a closet in the current house. It would have been a crawl space or a closet next to the chimney in the house when it was built. What we know, of course, is that the premise that this is where these girls slept, it may or may not be. Enslaved people didn't have rooms per se. You know, certainly there was in attics, people did sleep in attics, but very as often slept by the hearth, slept by on the floor next to the bed of the person who enslaved them, and so on. But the way we interpreted that was we rebuilt the room, and our interpretation was, did they live here? And I can show that to you. And in doing that, we were allowed to not just talk about that room, but we talked about all the ways that enslaved people lived with the people who enslaved them, which was the common circumstance in the North. And then the other thing we did was we rebuilt the front facade, not to scale, of the first home owned by an African-American man in Westport, built in 1806. So again, this was just a way to be impactful. The house still stands. And we very purposefully did it so when people saw it in the context of the exhibit and then passed the house, which is on a main road, it really meant something to them, we hoped. And I can show you that as well. So, you know, the nature of the exhibit was we tried to use everything at our disposal to make it very impactful, make it dramatic. We worked very closely with Team Westport, again, the town's Diversity Action Committee. To put this exhibit together, we had an advisory panel. I would say that anyone considering doing this work, it's extremely important. As much as we all may be skilled in research, this actually happens to be my area of expertise, the 18th century, particularly experience of African Americans. But outside of that, we really needed to go to other people. We had an advisory board of people who not only were qualified historically and as scholars, but were qualified in the terms of it was their lived experience as well. You know, for most of us, for many of us, that was important. Before it was installed. And that was incredibly powerful. We started talking to the school district about what we planned to do and how it could fit. And so we were fortunate enough to get their buy-in early. And they brought, you know, the 8th grade, the 10th grade, honors, social studies, and I think the 11th grade classes from Westport schools, which then actually spread the word because these children went home and told their parents. So that was really important. I will tell you that just a couple of things I'll say, because I don't want to take up too much time. One thing that was difficult for us was docent training, and I fully understand why. The material was very, very, very weighty, not only in terms of the themes that it covered, but in terms of the sheer volume of factual information. So we had a little bit of a difficult time training docents. People really did not feel comfortable with docenting this exhibit. So we went to the side of having text panels that were a little bit more text heavy than one normally would, so that people could self-guide. So that's just something to think about. You know, once your exhibit is up, who's going to present it? and who can feel comfortable to present it, and what can you do if they're not. Of course, you could do audio tours now and things like that. A couple of other things. We thought, when we built this exhibit, we thought about its longevity, not just in terms of it would run, but the time it would continue. So in the exhibit, one of the things we had was a wall of names of people who we knew were enslaved in Westport over an 80-year period of time, and some free people of color. And once the exhibit came down, we actually installed those names in our brick walk. There's a brick walk surrounding the property so that it could continue. And we always knew that we wanted to build it out more. Because of COVID, we've actually made the commitment to rebuilding the entire exhibit virtually. And now we're adding to it, so it lives, right? And we're adding oral histories, we're adding video content. But the exhibit was very deliberately built in such a way, again, thematically, so that we could keep adding to it, especially for use in schools, in educational opportunities, and frankly, to share with other similar organizations. So I don't know if I have time to show you a few pictures. I'll leave it to Beth, but perhaps later if not. I think you're muted, Beth.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, go ahead and share one or two, and then we'll try to move on to Gigi so we have plenty of time.
So let me do this. You can see my messy desktop, everybody. See how my mind works. So a couple of things really quickly. This, which does not seem to want to open. I'm sorry, doesn't seem to want to open. Okay, this is the wall of names that I spoke about. The lighter colored names are individuals who were free. I should tell you that we were really fortunate to have one of the 5 times great-grandsons of 2 of the people enslaved and appearing on the wall with their children come to the brick walk ceremony when we installed the brick walk. Here's an example of a panel, north versus south. You could see it's pretty dense, but it was a way to, and this was right in the beginning of the exhibit, it was a way to orient people to the idea that slavery in the North and slavery in the South was different yet the same in many ways. We wanted to disabuse people of the idea that, oh, it wasn't as bad in the North. That's what people like to say. It wasn't as bad. Here's an example of the room. This is the ground plan of the room. You can see it's just a little crawl space near the chimney. And I had wanted to show you, here it is, and here's just an example of the brick walk where the names got reinstalled. It's much bigger. But I'll leave it at that. And if anyone wants to see anything else of any of the other panels, I'm happy to share it.
Thank you, Ramin. That's wonderful. We're going to move over to Colchester and hear from Gigi Liverant there about their project there.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for your interest in our project, Emerging from the Shadows, a Story of Colchester's School for Colored Children, 1803 to 1804. This project, well, first let me explain my role in this project. I'm not a historian. I'm actually an artist by trade. So I'm a visual thinker. Facts frustrate me. Data, dates, and things like that frustrate me. But I feel like my role here was more of a catalyst to get this story into the public and to share it. So I don't speak from the role of the historian. We are a primarily volunteer organization. I see that Joni DiMartino is here. Joni, you did help us for a period of time, help get this exhibit to fruition. So we are primarily volunteers. So I'm going to talk about the evolution of how this exhibit came about, and hopefully it will encourage others of you to take the germ of an idea and to bring it to fruition. So let me see if I can get the screen share to work. Okay. Yay. Okay. It's a wonder. Okay, so we are the Colchester Historical Society, a small organization founded in oh, no, wait. Hold on a second. You know what? I got the wrong one. Give me 1 minute here. I'm going to get the right one going. Whoops.
While Gigi's doing that, I just want to mention that this is a project that won a CLHO Award of Merit.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
And we're working on the publicity for the current awards right now, but not everyone may know since we haven't done a big sort of publicity splash on that yet.
Yeah, we won that great award and now our museum is closed. So that's been a bit frustrating. Sorry, folks. I thought I had, I had to do another, I did a video Zoom for our senior center this morning and got the wrong one here to share with you. So hang on 1 minute while I find that. Here we go. Okay. Can we see this now? No, that is the wrong one. Oh my gosh. Not having a good day. Okay. Now. Oh, darn. My apologies. I thought I had this ready to go.
It's okay. Take your time.
Okay. 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 All right. Do we see this? No?
Gigi, I think you need to, once you have it open, then you can share your screen from Zoom.
How do I get back to Zoom? Wait a minute. Oops. Oh no. Okay, how do I get back here? You can see me, but I can't see you. Yikes. Can somebody tell me how to get back to Zoom here?
Did you try pressing Command Tab? You can toggle between applications that way.
Yeah. I did that. Yeah.
You could try to minimize your PowerPoint so that you could see the Zoom window.
Oh, right. Good idea. Okay, I apologize to everybody. Here we go. Here we go. Wait a minute. I apologize for all this confusion.
It's okay.
Good now.
It's okay. There we go.
Oh, we got it now?
Hooray!
Yay.
Yep.
Thank you all for your patience. Okay, okay. We good?
Yep.
Okay, thank you for your patience. Okay, so this is Emerging from the Shadows, Colchester story of the School for Colored Children, 1803 to 1840. So the first sort of published conversation about the existence of this school in Colchester in 1803, which was pretty early, was in John Warner Barber's publication, Connecticut Historical Collections. And he's the one who refers to the school as Colchester's, as the School for Colored Children, and hence the title, which we struggled with for a long time because, you know, obviously it would seem like African American history would be a more appropriate title. But because Barber called it the School for Colored Children, and in Colchester, it had basically been known as the School for Colored Children in town. I mean, so you can see the school in Barbara's image. You can see where I put the blue arrow, the school building, which was a repurposed district school. They moved it upon the building of Bacon Academy, which you see on the left of the church. And they had put the building over to adjacent to the church. And so that was our first, once we've seen that publication. And in 1979, Barbara Brown, a local teacher, along with James Rose, wrote Tapestry, a living history of families in Colchester, Black families in Colchester. And she mentions the school there as well. In 1994, a local teacher, Gail Jocelyn, was a student at the Hartford Seminary, and she wrote a paper on From Colchester to Canterbury, Practices and Policies of Congregationalists Regarding Slavery and the Education of African Americans. And she talks a fair amount about the school in her publication, well, it's not published, in her paper, which was never published. So along the way, we were getting bits and pieces of information about this school. In 1990 to 1998, a local historian, Abraham Hawk, spent time in Colchester, lived in Colchester, and spent a lot of time researching African Americans in Colchester. And he wrote some local articles about the school. But along the way, we knew bits and pieces, but we didn't know enough to create an exhibit. And in 1998, at the tricentennial of the town, due to Mr. Hawk's encouragement and research that he was doing, the town implemented they repurposed a small, what they call a carefree small building in the center of town to represent the school. And that became where people would visit. That became the temporary school for colored children, but there was nothing permanent, and it began to tell the story, but this building was open only on an occasional basis. So around 2014, trustees of Bacon Academy were contacted by historian and author Peter Hinks, Dr. Peter Hinks, who was looking for information about, he knew something about the school. He suspected there was some primary documents about the school mentioned, and he did have access to the bylaws of Bacon Academy. Whoops, I'm sorry, I jumped ahead, which mentions that it provides for the education of Negroes and persons of color in a separate building. So we knew this information, but we still did not have the ability to tell a story. And around 2016, the town of Colchester declared that temporary structure that was this, that represented the original school. That building had decayed, needed to be replaced. So a community effort was made to construct a new replica building of what the original schoolhouse may have looked like. So we called on Dr. Hinks, who we knew about this story and had done a lot of research on African Americans in the region. And he helped create what we thought a replica of the school might look like. So in April of 2016, he began helping us create that, what did that building look like? And so that building, construction began on that building. And in December of 2016, we wrote a grant to the Connecticut Humanities, thinking that we were ready based on what we learned to that point of creating an exhibit about the story of the school. But in May of 2017, we were denied. And the reason I'm mentioning this is I want to encourage other organizations that may be writing grants and may get denied to keep plugging away, because we were eventually, we rewrote the grant and changed it to a grant where we were going to do more research and we were going to learn more before we attempted to do the exhibit. So, you know, I find it's helpful to mention your failures because everybody learns from them. In 2017 of September, the replica school that you can see on the lower right was completed, and we partnered with the town of Colchester, the Historic District Commission, who oversees that small building. We partnered with them to create a dedication and a community conversation about African Americans in the region and the creation of the School for Colored Children. And Dr. Beverly Morgan, who is the Associate Director of External Affairs for the Museum of African American History at the Smithsonian Institution, was the keynote speaker. Beverly grew up in Colchester, so she could speak from her own experience and from the experience of a learned historian. So that school was dedicated. And once that school was built, the curiosity in Colchester citizens about that story really peaked. The building happens to be located across the street from the post office. And whenever I would go in the post office, they would say, you know, people are constantly asking about what that building is. What is that building? What is that about? And I was compelled that, you know, we have to tell this story. There is a curiosity about it. It is a story that sort of lingered around Colchester as legend. We really didn't know enough, so we began the process of researching. We brought Kaz Kozlowski in initially. She had just retired as director of the Prudence Crandall Museum, and we knew she could help us with this story, and she willingly joined us as a consultant to help us figure this out. And so we brought her in, and we eventually wrote another grant to the Connecticut Humanities to create the exhibit, having completed the research phase. And we successfully hired Kaz and Diana McCain to create the exhibit. The exhibit launched in April of 2019. With, as Ramin said, it is heavy on, like our exhibit is also heavy on text because there is so little primary documents to tell these stories. We have the Barber drawing of Colchester indicating the school. We have some primary documents, the bylaws of Bacon Academy. We have some lists of schools, district schools in Colchester where there are African-American students enlisted. The district schools had been integrated. And the understanding is that the outlying schools continued to be integrated, but the school in the center of town, the School for Colored Children, was a separate school. And the question remains, was the school created as, and I think there are two answers, is the school created as an educational opportunity for African Americans in Colchester? And there were a lot of abolitionists in Colchester. Most of the trustees on Bacon Academy's board that helped create the school were abolitionists. But also the question remains, was the school created to educate African American students separately? Because when Bacon Academy was created, they wanted to be an institute of higher learning. And they also wanted to attract students from out of state. And did they know that they would have difficulty attracting students from the South if they had an integrated school? So we don't know the answer to the question. I mean, it remains. Kaz and Diana did a tremendous amount of research, but the question still remains. We don't know. But it's a part of Colchester's history, and it was important to recognize it. So that's our story. That's how we got there.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Gigi. I'm going to turn over to Tammy Kay to talk about the project at the Lyman Allyn Museum.
Thank you so much. So our exhibit is called Stories of Resilience Encountering Racism. As Elizabeth mentioned, it's currently on view at the Lyman Allyn Museum, which just did reopen. It highlights the lives of 5 exceptional residents of our local area in New London County. And it's designed to show their incredible determination and strength in the face of personal and systemic racism. And it shows their remarkable successes despite some daunting obstacles that they had to face throughout their lives. The inspiration for this project came from the Federation's Encountering Differences program, which I'm the coordinator of. It connects students, primarily high school students, with African Americans in our community to learn their family histories and experiences related to race. It's an opportunity for them to learn outside the classrooms, to have a lot of small group discussions, and we found it was very beneficial in our area because it's not particularly diverse. We're working primarily with largely white high schools. So we embarked upon this exhibit with a very strong partnership with the Lyman Allyn Museum, because we are not historians, as some of the other folks mentioned. I am a program coordinator and facilitator, but we wanted to share what these incredible hosts and mentors were sharing with the students with a wider audience. So we formed a relationship with Lyman Allyn because our recently retired executive director had a long-standing relationship with the Lyman Allyn Museum, and they had worked on some other projects together, and so we agreed to embark on this one. So their staff was amazing and really helped guide us in terms of framing the exhibit, the overall message, the themes, and then all of the content for the exhibit came from their personal experiences and stories that they had shared with their student groups in our program. So we actually developed the panels, the text for the panels for the exhibit according to the guidance that Lyman Allyn had given us. There were bio panels for each individual who is featured, and I have some examples that I can show you later if time allows. And then there were story panels that highlighted various aspects of their family story that related to the central themes of the exhibit. And when thinking about the themes and the messages we wanted to convey, we wanted to use history and personal experiences to, bring things full circle, things that were relevant over long periods of time throughout history and in the present environment. So there were things like voting rights and education. There were some historical themes of the Great Migration, the Civil Rights Movement, marches and sit-ins. Some of these folks were directly involved with some of that activity, and the exhibit brought out the experiences that they had participating in marches and sit-ins. It also dealt a lot with seen and unseen racism. Someone mentioned previously that, no one thought things were bad in the North, so it brought in, one particular host perspective. She grew up in the North, coming from the South, and how she experienced racism as a young child of 4 or 5, coming with her friends in kindergarten and preschool, and some of the experiences that she had. We also brought in a tremendous number of artifacts and personal photos from these folks that were part of their story. And those were all accompanied with smaller text panels that put the artifact into context. And we also were very fortunate to have a retired multimedia professional work with us who designed all the panels for us. He took photographs of all of the individuals who were featured, and he also recorded a tremendous amount of video of these individuals sharing their personal oral histories on camera. And he edited that video footage into a 10-minute continuous loop that ran as part of the exhibit. In addition to the exhibit itself, we also had programming that we developed as part of it. On the opening night of the exhibit, we had a panel discussion which featured everyone who was featured in the exhibit, as well as some of the other folks who have worked to help us with the student groups as part of the Encountering Differences program. We have one of the deans at Connecticut College who works with the students to provide them a history of anti-Black racism in the US, and he was able to join us on the panel discussion as well. There was really tremendous response. This was all pre-COVID and pre the killing of George Floyd, but we had record crowds that night at the museum. And in the first 2 weeks that the exhibit was open, there were over 1,000 people through, which was a large number for that particular venue. Unfortunately, the museum closed given COVID-19. But we did manage to get some school groups through before everyone went to online learning. And of course now post George Floyd, the exhibit is getting a lot more attention. There's been articles in the Day and on the front page of the Current. We've had a lot of interest from other venues in terms of trying to bring the exhibit to other places so that more people can see it. And I can, if there's time, I can share a few photos if you would like.
That would be great, Tammy.
That'd be great. Yeah, I need to take a couple minutes for that so we can entertain some questions.
Okay, so this is a wide view of the exhibit. The museum staff did an amazing job at staging all of this for us. You can see the artifacts are in these beautiful display cases, and then the panels and other artifacts on the wall behind. Let me see. This is, we had banners made, that's what you're seeing on the left. So there was a large banner for each person who was featured hanging in the space. On the right is the biographical panel. Again, I know a lot of people said their panels were text heavy. Ours were the same. This is an example of one of the story panels, and some of the photos that we used were stock photos that were in the public domain, as well as personal photos. On the bottom here you can see that's an actual photo from a protest that this individual, Florence Clark, had in her personal collection of when she participated in a protest in her college years. We did bring in some other props to bring out some of the themes from the Great Migration. I mentioned one of the hosts who came to the New London area at a very young age. She couldn't understand why there was such a commotion with the family packing the car with the supplies that were needed for the journey, and the cans of gasoline, the rolls of toilet paper, and all the food and their belongings. And then we have a replica of a green book there to illustrate, that you had to take all this stuff because you weren't welcome at facilities, and you had to plan accordingly for that. These are some other artifacts from a host we had who grew up in Greenville, Mississippi. His family, his parents were sharecroppers. So he has Mississippi cotton, Mississippi rice, and Mississippi sugar, which we had on display. In addition to he had quite a collection of artifacts. You can see also in the corner something more recent is a card from the KKK, which was left at a courthouse where he was working in the 90s. Left to intimidate him. So we put that on display as well. These are some other artifacts. A poll tax receipt, which was one of the individual's family's most prized possession, because it was a very large sum of money that they had to pay, very disproportionate to an African American's income. And then to the right, he also owns original copies of voter tests that were given, which of course we know many were skewed to prevent African Americans from voting. And that's the quick snapshot of the exhibit.
Thank you so much, Tammy. That's wonderful. Emma, do you want to invite any questions or?
Sure. I haven't seen anything come through in the chat. And I might just kick things off sort of selfishly by asking our presenters one question to start things off. It sounds like each of you was sort of working to push back against some kind of persistent myths that are here, especially in the Northeast, around people of color and around slavery, that there haven't been people of color here, that slavery was not an issue in the North. I'm curious how, and other sorts of kind of persistent myths about, how this is kind of a white place. I'm wondering if you felt your exhibits had an impact in sort of dispelling some of those myths that you were working against.
I'll answer that. I'll jump in and answer part of it, at least for us. I think, so I do feel the exhibit, in fact, did dispel a lot of myths. We did have a lot of people come in and say they were shocked. They didn't know any of this, that we opened their eyes. We still have people telling us that with respect to the ongoing work we're doing on social media, sharing this information. I will tell you, to be fully candid, there persists in people saying that is not true, that is not what I remember, that's not what I was taught. But what I feel is that those comments equally indicate that we are breaking the myth open, because if the fact that they feel the need to testify to us how wrong we are and how much it's against their worldview and what they believe means that we've set something ticking in their mind. Because if they were fully 100% inculcated in that belief, they would kind of ignore us and move on. So I take that criticism as a win as much as I take any praise as a win. But we've had many, many people tell us that they never knew any of this history and are just completely amazed and shocked, and that they have to think about things differently.
Yeah, we pretty much had the same response, was that people weren't at all aware, or had no idea there were so many African Americans living in our region. I mean, they were there because Colchester was a huge farming community, and so there were a fair amount of slaves. There are records of those and the exhibit has a lot of those numbers from the census of how many African Americans were living and working there. And what happened initially when we proposed creating the exhibit around the school, and even when that replica building was built, was there was pushback from people, and it addresses what you said, Ramin, of people saying, why are you celebrating segregation? It's like, and we weren't sure how to respond to that at first, but we realized we're not celebrating segregation. We're recognizing part of our local history, part of our regional history that really has not been brought to light. So hence the name Emerging from the Shadows. I mean, really, people knew very little about this, and the physical existence of the replica building really piqued people's interest and curiosity, and to a certain extent, their disbelief that that was part of the history. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's likewise true for us. I mean, my particular focus was heavily with students, and I know that the student groups that I had the opportunity to bring through the museum, it's just so different for them to see, personal aspects. It just makes such a larger impression than reading about something in a textbook. And most of the groups that I got to bring through, I brought them through with their host who was featured in the exhibit. So they got to see the exhibit with the people that were featured in the exhibit and the people that they worked with in the program, which was tremendously impactful to be there in the same space at the same time.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions that have come through. The first from Elizabeth. For Gigi, do you know how many children attended the Colchester School?
We don't have numbers because we don't have records of those students. We have some records of the integrated district schools, the students that attended there. The guess was there was maybe about 30 students per class, and the school operated from 1803 to 1840. But beyond that, we don't know who the students were because there have been no records found yet. We're also hoping that by bringing this exhibit to light that maybe somebody has something somewhere that they will share with us. And we're in hopes of getting more information, but we don't know.
Yeah, it seems like all of these, are collecting opportunities as well as interpretation opportunities.
Yeah.
There's another question for you, Gigi. What did Beverly Morgan Welsh speak about? Was her topic the school, or was she talking about a broader subject?
She was talking about a broader subject. She spoke about her experience growing up in Colchester, and she did, talk about the racism she personally experienced, and and then she spoke broader about, basically about racism and opportunity, and how we can all do a better job. In essence, yeah.
There's a question from Kayla for all the panelists here. All of you mentioned a lack of primary documents as being sort of a challenge in mounting these programs. Did you state anywhere in your exhibits or interpretation that the absence of that documentation was in some ways, an intentional part of the process, like, that some records are kept and others are not, and that these are the sorts of records that were intentionally not preserved in the past? Was that something you addressed directly?
Yeah, I can answer. Kaz Kozlowski and Diana McCain created the exhibit for us. And they basically, we discussed what the content was going to be. And we thought that was important. That was the reason the documents were not preserved, because there was pushback along, as we know, there's been pushback against the advancement and educational opportunities for African Americans going way back. So, those were not considered important, or they were, purposefully destroyed. We don't know, but they don't exist that we have found. And numerous, Dr. Peter Hink's search, Diana search, Kaz search. I mean, lots of people have looked Maybe in somebody's attic there's something, but that'd be nice.
Did anyone else address that directly in your interpretation, like about the lack of sources? Oh, Ramin.
Sorry. We talked about it in several ways. We talked about it very directly. We used the documentary evidence that we had to speak about in the interpretation, in the program book. We kept updating the program book. A couple of things. The first is that we were very clear that the documentary evidence that we had were legal documents as a way to point out that African Americans were property in the period of enslavement. And therefore that's why you don't see obviously diaries and things like that. So we made a point of pointing out the absence of personal documents as a way to address this. We also, within our own archives, were very clear about the fact that the file on slavery in the archives is tiny, and yet the documentary evidence in personal papers of families is actually quite substantive. We are still finding documents, deeds, and probate records, and so on. But we use that to talk about the fact that they were buried deliberately, frankly, by the organization, not bringing them out and cataloging them so they were easily found once discovered. And secondarily, and for the families that donated these documents, these were business records. They uniformly fall within business records. So they almost didn't, I don't think they even knew they were in there, frankly, much to our benefit. I think if it was known that they were in there, they would have been removed, because we do still have pushback from people saying, not my family. So we talked about it a great deal. We felt it was very important.
Great. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question about sort of the bias of the archive itself and how much you talk to the public about that in your interpretation. So I really appreciate that question, Kayla. Thank you. Dawn came in a little bit late, but she has sort of a lengthy question here and is essentially looking for help and resources. She's working with a post-Reconstruction Black town full of stories and Black history, formed in 1892, and urgently trying to help the local historian preserve stories and help him move to a mid-century home by a famous resident that was donated. They need to raise funds to make upgrades on the home to properly exhibit the content, and are looking for sort of suggestions from the group. I think this includes the whole audience here. This isn't a Connecticut place, it's outside of Chicago, but if anyone has ideas of federal resources to share, she would really appreciate it. Did anyone have any luck getting anything other than state dollars for the exhibits that they were working on here?
I can try.
We didn't get anything outside of the state. We did get a recommendation from Congressman Himes for an IMLS award, which would have led to other grants. But I think that, and I think someone just said what I was about to say, NEH will do some preservation grants. But what I would encourage you to do, Dawn, is here in Connecticut, for example, we have something called the State Historic Preservation Office, or SHPO as we call it. And I'm sure the state of Illinois has something very similar. And the importance of either the owner of the building or the intended use of the building might trigger some kind of similar state funding for the itself based on what it's going to house. I would check there. I don't know what it's called in Illinois, but here it's called the State Historic Preservation Office. I'm sure it's called something very similar in Illinois.
Yeah, and Todd Levine from SHPO is actually with us today, and he's put the 1772 Foundation, and Joni suggests the National Trust for Historic Preservation.
Yeah.
So hopefully, Don, you can follow up on some of these leads. We're a few minutes over time. I want to take this moment to thank everyone for the presentations that they've made and for sharing the stories of these really excellent and thought-provoking projects. I think this represents some of the really excellent work that's going on around the state of Connecticut to really reveal some of these less well-researched or less often interpreted stories and really bring them into the story of our state. and make them a part of what people learn in the classroom, at museums, and as they grow up and learn around the state of Connecticut. So I want to thank you all for the work that you've done at all of your organizations and for being willing to take the time today to share that with the group. Thank you all for being here. I can stick around for a few minutes if anybody has any other questions, but I'm going to stop the recording now. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody, so much. And if those who are attending this program have ideas about resources that would be helpful to you, please don't hesitate to contact CLHO with those ideas. Thank you.
Indeed.